Stuart McConey tells the story of the two electronic music pioneers who were instrumental in creating Stevie Wonder's classic period.
What you're hearing right now is Tonto, the original new timbral orchestra. And although it looks like a supercomputer that might pilot one of Arthur C. Clarke's spaceships, it's actually the biggest synthesizer in the world. It was developed by Malcolm Cecil and Robert Margouleff, who used it to create a groundbreaking album of electronic music in the early 1970s. It's a cult classic, but like them, it remains virtually unknown. You will certainly be familiar with their other work, however, because when a certain Stevland Morris chose to collaborate with them, the trio would produce some of the most important albums in the history of pop music.
Don't you worry about a thing. Don't you worry about a thing, mama. What you trying to do?
The music you've just heard is from what are, for me, Stevie Wonder's finest albums: Music of My Mind, Talking Book, Inner Visions and Fulfillingness' first finale. They are cornerstones of pop music, a combination of electronics and funk. This incredible collection of songs has been influencing musicians and producers and songwriters ever since their release in the early 1970s. Although no one's disputing Stevie Wonder's genius, it was Robert Margouleff and Malcolm Cecil's production talents and electronic ingenuity that gave him the tools to develop his finest work, now regarded as his classic period. These two sonic architects also went on to work with big-name acts such as the Isley Brothers, George Harrison, Gil-Scott Heron and Devo. They have one of the most fascinating stories in rock and roll. So why have you never heard of them? It's time to look at two of music's lesser-known legends and find out why they've been unfairly consigned to rock and roll's backroom staff. Malcolm Cecil grew up obsessed with electronics and engineering. Called up to national service in the late 1950s, he trained as a radio engineer. He was also an accomplished musician, and by the 1960s had built up quite a reputation as a bass player. He played with Mick Jagger in Blues Incorporated. He was the resident bassist at Ronnie Scott's, and later principal bassist for the BBC Radio Orchestra. He also loved experimental music, and The Who's Pete Townsend remembers watching him give a rather unusual lecture at Ealing College.
Malcolm, as I remember it, and I may well be gilding the lily here a bit, but he did quite a kind of controversial lecture. He started to talk about, there are loads of different ways you can play the bass. You can bang it, bang, bang, bang. And he said, and then you've got this bow, and he said you can slap the bow and you can saw at it. Because he said, I saw at the strings, you can saw at the strings with a bow, man. And he was playing and he was showing off. And he was quite a showman. Somebody handed him a wood saw and said, could you use this instead of a bow, And he immediately just started to play with the bow. And it soared quickly through his strings and soared about 3 inches through the face of his bass.
Malcolm Cecil.
I didn't actually saw the whole bass off, just took the strings off. But of course they made a big poinging sound, and he was most impressed with this, apparently.
Hugely influential to me, because very soon after, in the band's, The Who's early performances, I took on board not only what Gustav Metzger had said about autodestructive art, but seeing a musician destroying an instrument. That was Malcolm Cecil.
He has now credited me with being the inspiration for him setting fire to guitars. I'm not sure that I really want that responsibility.
In the late 1960s, Malcolm was struck down by a lung illness. Unable to continue playing live, he left London for New York in 1968. He got a job at Media Sound Studios as an engineer, where he met Bob Margouleff. Bob had recently purchased an early synthesizer and was fascinated in creating new, weird and wonderful sounds. The pair immediately hit it off,
I had hair down to my elbows and a gold embroidered vest and a beard. And usually there was a joint sticking out of my mouth. And Malcolm had long hair. He sort of looked like a big Q-tip. Thin, very thin, wore overalls. Malcolm said, listen, you teach me how to play the synthesizer and I'll teach you how to be an engineer.
Back then, synthesizer technology was still in its infancy and a completely futuristic and alien concept to most musicians. The Beatles' Abbey Road album was one of the first to feature a Moog, a very early synthesizer module named after its creator, Bob Moog. They were expensive, rare, and notoriously difficult to program. Here's Pete Townsend.
They were, in a word, bollocks. You collect all this stuff together, you put it in, like the ARP, for example, the way it was described was an interesting sight with lots of flashing lights. Well, what that was lots of modules where there would be things going on, but if you wanted to make music out of it, you had to link those things up, and it wouldn't have mattered. The synthesizers of the Tonto and the ARP period that followed were meant to look intimidating and amazing, and it really always does depend what you do with them,
Bob and Malcolm could see enormous potential in this burgeoning technology. Using Bob's Moog 3 as a starting block, they set about building their own super synthesizer. I caught up with Professor Trevor Pinch, author of Electronic Music Bible, Analog Days, to ask him about the creation of Tonto. Trevor, for the layperson, if you could give us an idea of what Tonto was. I mean, generally, we know it's a synthesizer.
Tonto is the biggest synthesizer in the world. It's a gigantic thing. One of the most interesting things about Tonto is the shape of the thing. It's like being inside a spaceship. The modules are curved towards the performer.
Wow.
So you're kind of inside the machine. And Bob and Malcolm put together stuff so that you could make sounds that other people couldn't make so easily.
Everything on Tonto is analog. We're talking pre-computers here, so its hundreds of knobs and buttons were controlled by hand and guesswork. It's a fantastic-looking thing, and Malcolm still has Tonto set up in his house. He was kind enough to show us, so here he is with a quick guide. Oh, and be sure to check out the Radio 4 website, where we've posted the video version.
First of all, the entire instrument is intended to be played by multiple people. And the instrument is a series of synthesizers made by different manufacturers. Instruments made by Oberheim. We have also Moog instruments made by Surge and ARP, the EMS. And normally these instruments don't like to play together. They don't like to talk to each other. And Tonto is the means of doing that. It was put together to become the first instrument multi-timbral orchestra. Timbre is French for sound quality, so multi-timbres means we have multiple sound qualities, different instruments if you wish, different sounds simultaneously available. And an example of that would be these 4 voice instruments here. I think we have it up here. That's the first sound. Second sound. Third sound. Fourth sound. Now notice.
Back at the studio, Bob and Malcolm were working on advert music by day, but by night they formed a band, Tonto's Expanding Headband, and set about recording their debut album, Zero Time. Here's the synth professor Trevor Pinch again. So this is 1971 Zero Time.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that, because does it still stand up, do you think? Is it a landmark piece of electronic music?
Yeah, I think it's a classic. It's really stood the test of time, and it's all done on the Moog synthesizer. And Malcolm, in particular, his technical knowledge of how to make the music, and Bob's feel for the music, the two of them together, it's a magical album. I remember hearing that myself. This was about 1971, and I remember putting that album on and saying, my God, that album's incredible. I had a friend actually who couldn't listen to it. It disturbed him so much. It was such a weird sound.
Here's Bob Margouleff.
It changed our lives completely. The record came out and got this really wonderful full-page review in Rolling Stone, which at that time was the organ of the masses, of the young people, our compatriots. And the next thing I know is a fellow bass player friend of Malcolm's came to Media Sound one night bringing along Stevie, who was wearing a bright lime green jumpsuit.
Malcolm picks up the story.
He showed up at my door with an album under his arm, and the album was Zero Time. And Stevie apparently was quite taken by the idea that this was a keyboard instrument that he could possibly play that made all these sounds, because he was tired of having to play his songs to an arranger who would then go away, write the arrangement, record the track with the band, call Stevie in after it was recorded, tell him where he had to sing, what he had to sing, and then send him away again while they did the mix. And Stevie said it sounded nothing like what the song sounded like in his head.
Stevie had been with his record label Motown since he was 11 years old. By 1971, he was desperately unhappy with them. As well as feeling creatively stifled, he thought the company had been paying him a pittance compared to the amount of units he'd been shifting. When his 21st birthday came around, he was out of his contract, and he immediately told a stunned Motown he was leaving. Within a few weeks, he'd moved from the Detroit Hit Factory to a New York recording studio. By the end of the first week, Stevie, Bob and Malcolm had recorded 17 songs. It was enough for their first album together, Music of My Mind.
Sweet little girl, you know your baby love you. Your love is driving me crazy, crazy, crazy. Sweet little girl.
Early on, Bob and Malcolm decided Stevie should play all of the instruments.
We found that Steve was multi-talented. He played the piano, he played the clavinet, he played the synthesizer, as long as Malcolm and I would contend with the knobs and the programming. And we would be able to work together in a very cooperative way. And we'd have all the instruments in a circle in the studio, all hot, all up at the console at all times. And Steve could walk from one instrument to another without having us go, oh, let's tune up the snare drum a little bit more, or do this or do that. Every instrument was there, ready to play.
It was a completely new recording environment for Stevie. He even played the drums.
It's not like he'd never sat at a drum kit before, but I don't believe he'd ever played on any records or anything before. He had no idea where the drums would be. So I would say to him, hit a tom-tom, and he'd start flailing in the air, and I'd move the tom-tom to that position. Hit the cymbal, and he'd start, and then I'd move the cymbal to that position. So he had a setup that looked very strange, but he knew where it was. It was like, well, why are we going to get a drummer? This is fine. It sounds really good.
Every day I wanna fly my kite, and every day I wanna fly my kite, and every day I wanna get on my camel and ride. Ooh.
To the surprise of the music industry, Stevie re-signed with Motown Records, but this time he had complete creative control and a considerably more generous contract. The album was released in March 1972 and charted just outside the top 20. It was a modest hit, but thanks to its futuristic production, it made a big impact with the world's music industry. Rolling Stone magazine called it the best thing to come out of Motown since Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. The sheer volume of incredible music pouring out of Stevie's head forced Malcolm and Bob to come up with ingenious ways to make sure they didn't miss a thing.
There was always a 2-track room tape running at 7.5 IPS. I have fired more than one assistant for letting that tape run out. And all that was going on to it was whatever was going over the speakers at the time. It was intended as a reference, because being unsighted, Stevie would sit down at the piano while we were setting up mics on something. He'd get bored, he'd sit down at the piano and start playing and singing. And he'd come up with all sorts of things, and he wouldn't consciously remember them, but we would go through those tapes and just sort of skim through them and say, oh, yeah, remember that thing you were doing just before we did such and such? Yeah, listen to this, man. You know, we'd play him a little snippet. And, oh, yeah, okay, that's a great idea. Yeah, then he'd go out in the studio and we'd do another song. That's how we got 240 songs in, you know, the time we were together.
For the sunshine of my life, yeah. That's why I'll always stay around. Yeah.
The trio's second album, Talking Book, was released in October 1972. All of the songs were created through a collaborative process between Stevie, Bob and Malcolm.
With an instrument like Tonto, you can't write a line ahead of time, because until you get the sound up, you don't know how it's going to react with the other sounds. So everything was done sort of jazz fashion. It was all head arrangements. We would come up with things, and sometimes some of the lines would be suggested. You know, the dum dum da da boo da boo bum bum ba da, that horn line. I was singing it to the thing, and Steve, hey, yeah, man, and he starts playing it. And next thing, it's in the song. That was how we worked.
Very superstitious, writings on the wall. Very superstitious, letters about to fall.
Superstition was the first time Stevie had topped the American charts in 10 years. The album's combination of funk grooves, electronic bass and synthesizers has been imitated ever since. Talking Book took 3 Grammys in 1973, but there was no let-up in the recording. Stevie just kept on writing, and Bob and Malcolm had to keep up.
There were no hours. We worked night and day. Whenever Steve felt like he wanted to work, so we'd come in around 7 o'clock in the evening. Malcolm and I would get there around 4:30 or 5 o'clock, and we would keep lists of songs. We had like a library. Steve would start songs, and we'd put them away, and then we'd keep track of them. Oh, this one needs drums. This one could use a synthesizer part. Well, Steve, what are you going to think about the words for this song or that song?
Due to the sheer volume of songs they were recording, and Stevie's blindness, it was impossible for him to remember all the words. Malcolm had to read them out via a mic into Stevie's headphones half a bar before, and then, remarkably, Stevie would coordinate playing the piano and singing. For me, the next album the trio produced, 1973's Inner Visions, is the best of the 4. Don't You Worry About a Thing, He's Mr. Know-It-All, Higher Ground, every song on it a stone-cold hit. Bob and Malcolm really stretched Stevie to his limits too. Just listen to how they coaxed out that standout vocal performance on Living for the City.
We had to find a way to get the vocal rougher and harder, sounding like somebody had been through some real shit. So we decided the only thing to do was try and get Stevie real angry and get his voice hoarse. So when we were recording that vocal for the last verse again, we kept on doing stuff that would get him angry. And one of the things he hates is stopping in the middle. You know, if he doesn't say stop the tape in the middle of a vocal, you let it run. Well, we broke that rule. I kept on stopping the tape. Come on, Stevie, you can do better than that. This is shit. And I was really shirty with him and everything. And we got him hoarse. We wouldn't give him tea, because he likes this tea with no milk in it with lemon to clear the throat. We wouldn't give him the tea. He was getting really upset with it. I think he's still upset with me about that. But we got a great track.
His hair is long, his feet are hard and gritty. He spends his life walking the streets of New York City. He's almost dead from breathing in air pollution. He tried to vote, but to him there's no solution. Living just enough for the shit's.
While Bob and Malcolm were busy mastering the completed album, disaster struck. Whilst on tour, Stevie was in a serious car accident. He was hit in the head by a stray log from a lumber truck. It put Stevie in a coma for several days. Although he recovered, both Malcolm and Bob felt Stevie was never really the same after the accident. It signalled the beginning of the end for them. Inner Visions was a huge commercial success. It went on to win Grammys, including a Best Engineering Award for Bob and Malcolm. But the two producers felt their hard work was going unnoticed. On Music of My Mind, they were credited as associate producers. By Inner Visions, they were relegated to mere programmers.
Malcolm and I and Stevie produced those records fully together, the three of us. We put a lot of energy and time into it, but our credits got smaller and smaller and smaller, and more people got involved in Stevie's career, and it finally got a place where we felt we were being squeezed out. We weren't being compensated for correctly. We weren't getting our royalties that we should have gotten from record number one. And I don't even know whether Steve really realized it or not.
Stevie didn't even thank them when he collected their Grammy for Best Engineering. Music historian Mark Sinker has a theory as to why Bob and Malcolm were kept virtually a secret.
The people round him would have been feeling that to make a big deal of these two white guys as producers, at the same time as this record was clearly stepping forward in a way, actually everyone would have said to themselves, what's changed here is that these new guys have come in and they're responsible for the change, especially in an intensely political time.
Bob and Malcolm continued to work with Stevie, though, co-producing his ex-wife Sarita Wright's album in 1974. The trio also produced Minnie Riperton's Perfect Angel album, now regarded as a classic. And Bob and Malcolm began to work on non-Stevie projects, such as albums for Jeff Beck, Billy Preston and the Isley Brothers. But Bob and Malcolm's next album with Stevie would prove to be their last. Michael Sembello was on guitar and recalls watching Stevie, Bob and Malcolm working together with, as ever, Tonto at the centre of everything they did.
Incredible to watch them work because he really listened to them too. And they knew how to take what he needed to do and translate it into the technical world, because he made them take the synthesizer and do things probably, if it wasn't for all three of them getting together in a room, we wouldn't have all the great advancements in synthesizers. He had them, before you could bend a note on a synthesizer, how do you do this? I want this, I want it to sound like this, I want it to sound like a guitar. I mean, I remember them constantly coming up with all these wacky ideas,
Malcolm's pitch-bending joystick has been standard issue on synthesizers ever since. It can be heard being put to good use on Boogie On Reggae Woman.
Boogie on reggae woman, what is wrong with me? Boogie on reggae woman, baby, can you see?
1974's Fulfillingness' first finale was Stevie's first US #1 album since 1963, and it took 3 more Grammy Awards. But as the album was being completed, Malcolm was becoming increasingly angered by Stevie's hangers-on.
I made the final decision to leave Stevie in the middle of Fulfillingness' first finale when we were recording a vocal, and there were probably 30 people in this very large control room making a racket, and the noise was getting to me. So I just turned around to everybody and said, "Excuse me, but do you think we could keep it down to a dull roar?" And Stevie, of course, hearing this, turned around and said, "Hey, man, don't talk to my friends that way." And I just thought to myself, the relationship has changed. It used to be just us in the studio doing the music. Now there's all these people partying, got nothing to do with the music, distracting me, distracting Stevie, and they're more important. I just stood up from the console and I just said, "Then perhaps they can help you make your album." And I just walked out.
Bob followed a few months later.
It was really a business decision that really caused me and Malcolm and Steve to go our separate ways. We really felt that we should have been able to participate in the royalties on his records, and he did not feel the same way about it. The reality is those 4 albums were produced by me, Malcolm, and Stevie, and that's the truth.
When I started to believe that he really didn't appreciate what I was doing, it was really a knife in the heart. And then it was like, well, why am I doing this? I should be doing my Tonto things. This is what I really want to do.
Malcolm and Bob left Stevie with a raft of unreleased songs, many of which appeared on what is, for me, Stevie's last great album, Songs in the Key of Life. I'm not disputing that Stevie Wonder is a musical genius, but it does strike me as interesting that after Songs in the Key of Life, he never released another album anywhere near the quality of the work he did with Bob and Malcolm. Bob and Malcolm began work on the long-awaited second album from Tonto's expanding headband, but by the time it came out in the mid-1970s, they'd been left behind by other electronic artists like Vangelis and Jean-Michel Jarre. They did continue to work with some big names, though. Malcolm carried on with the Isley Brothers and was also sought out by stars like George Harrison and Ravi Shankar. Malcolm has also worked on 15 Gil-Scott Heron albums. In 1980, Bob produced seminal new wave band Devo and their album Freedom of Choice. Tonto actually lived in Devo singer Mark Mothersbaugh's studio for a few years, and the album featured their most famous hit, Whip It. As the years progressed, so did synthesizer technology. By the early 1980s, computers were able to control synthesizer modules. Digital sounds replaced analog. Tonto was superseded by more user-friendly technology, and Malcolm and Bob found themselves less and less in demand. Now in his 70s, Malcolm is still playing and recording, as is Tonto, which resides in a studio at the bottom of his garden. It's in full working order, and he's developed a digital version, which he sometimes performs on at music festivals. Bob runs his own surround sound company, and he's recently worked on movies such as Lord of the Rings, Hellboy 2 and Toy Story 3. The halcyon days with Stevie Wonder now seem a long time ago, but the music they helped create still resonates today. I asked the synth professor Trevor Pinch whether history had unfairly overlooked them.
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's one of these stories, I hope it's not like Delia Derbyshire, you know, getting recognition. Sometimes you get recognition sort of too late. For me personally, I think people who know stuff about the history of electronic music know the role of Tonto and Bob Margolin and Malcolm Sissle, but it hasn't got wider recognition, in all honesty, not yet. And hopefully people will recognise that, in fact, these so-called backroom boffins were actually shaping the sound of the 1970s, 1980s, and right through to today. Enormous numbers of people have a debt to Malcolm Sissle and Bob Margolin, a debt they're probably not aware of.
I get the impression that Bob and Malcolm don't care much anyway. They know what they did.
I never really equated art with money, you know. I know that you're supposed to, but I always equated art with pleasure and with enjoyment, and the money thing was always secondary to the art. We were both very free spirits. We were really in it for the music. I like to say it was like 3 meteors in the sky, and they're all flying toward one another, and for one brief second there's this huge bright light when they all 3 meteors cross paths at the same time, and there's just this brilliant flash, and then it goes away. And that's the way it was with me and Steve and Malcolm.